We, the participants of the Gaborone Summit, acknowledge that African citizens support constitutionalism and presidential term limits, applaud former African heads of state who have demonstrated commitment to uphold democratic values and term limits, and continue to actively engage in good office as mediators and facilitators in response to constitutional crisis and recent military coups in parts of the continent. Note that a growing number of citizen-led movements have emerged in support of constitutionalism and term limits through deployment of innovative strategies that foster peaceful collaboration across boundaries. Commend the peaceful transfer of executive power through credible and inclusive elections in Africa that have strengthened democratic practice and institutions. But note with concern that in recent years, the democratic trend across the continent has shifted towards one of democratic expansion and consolidation, the democratic trend across the continent has shifted from one of democratic expansion and consolidation to one of autocratic resurgence and democratic decline. Regret that the hard-earned democratic advances of the early 1990s are being undermined by authoritarian leaders and military regimes that shrink political space, exacerbate social divisions, disrupt economic development, and challenge constitutional norms to maintain the hold on power. Regret that efforts in many countries to strengthen the rule of law, social justice, and national reconciliation have been rolled back with potentially dire consequences for vulnerable populations, and urge regional economic communities to formulate legal frameworks that strengthen presidential term limits. In this challenging context, we celebrate Africa's youthful population, which is eager to participate and contribute to the democratic governance and the development of their respective countries. We regret that reluctance by some leaders to adhere to the term limits denies youth opportunities for their participation in peaceful and orderly renewal of political leadership and alternation of power. We further affirm and commit ourselves to the following. Number one, promoting and defending principles of constitutionalism and enhancing democratic consolidation. We, the signatories, commit to creating synergies among Africans at both the grassroots and leadership levels aimed at consolidating constitutionalism and bolstering democratic resilience. Add our voices to efforts in favor of respecting and restoring term limits, constitutional rule and the rule of law, more broadly as vital ingredients for peace, stability, continental integration, and equitable development across the continent. Pledge individually and collectively to promote the principles of constitutionalism and the rule of law as set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, African Union Constitutive Act, African Union Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, which is the charter going forth, and constitutions of African countries, especially as those relating to presidential term limits and renewal of political leadership. Support the aspirations of Africans who embrace the principles of democratic constitutional rule embodied in the Charter, allowing for political change through regular, credible, transparent, and inclusive elections. Commit through our individual and collective actions to reject attempts to enact constitutional provisions that weaken term limits, undermine democratic institutions, and subvert citizens' will. We call on the African Union, the Regional Economic Communities, RECs, and the democratic African governments to enact reforms and adopt guidelines to ensure the constitutional amendment processes that foster respect for democratic rights and are based on a national consensus. We strongly recommend early prevention by democratic former heads of state, civil society, religious and traditional leaders, labor unions, media, and other stakeholders to safeguard democratic practices and institutions, including presidential term limits. Number 2, supporting ethical leadership and thriving societies. We, the signatories, commit to recognize in democratic societies, leaders are guided by the social contract that binds the people and those who govern within the framework of the Constitution and the democratic values embraced by society as a whole. Appeal to leaders to look not just to the letter, but also to the spirit of constitutions and other legal instruments, and aspire to ethical leadership that enhances national well-being. Believe that leaders who reaffirm constitutional principles through their conduct and actions promote continental peace, stability, and development, as opposed to those who weaken constitutionalism, tailor national progress to the sole benefit of the single leader or party, and thus contribute to societal division, instability, and in some cases, violence. Note that in many cases, rifts in the social fabric create a favorable environment, malign external influence, extremist groups, and other criminal syndicates that undermine national sovereignty, security, stability, and positive youth development. Commend sitting heads of state who respect term limits and peaceful transfer of power. Urge political parties to nurture and promote accountable and responsive political leadership that is inclusive and reflective of the makeup of society, and applaud judiciaries that demonstrate independence and oppose attempts to manipulate constitutional and electoral frameworks. We call on African leaders to build trust and create stable, thriving societies that consolidate constitutionalism and the rule of law, and allow for greater predictability in governance, economic and human development, and the peaceful transfer of executive power. Number 3, facilitating inclusive democratic processes and the renewal of political leadership. We, the signatories, commit to note that despite efforts at greater gender balance in the political sphere on the continent, women and girls continue to face political violence and substantial barriers to political participation, including elective office. Supporting aspiring women leaders so they make their full weight felt in policymaking and political processes in their respective countries. Recognize that collectively, we must create and sustain opportunities for young people to contribute through their dynamism and innovative ideas for strengthening democratic governance. Pledge to use our positions to work in solidarity with young people, especially those of diverse identities and backgrounds, including young women, to ensure their participation in democratic processes and that they have meaningful opportunities to exercise their political rights. And call on African heads of state, political parties, civil society, media, and citizens at large to take responsibility for creating environments that allow everyone, independent of age, gender, sexual orientation, disability, or other individual characteristics, to participate in and contribute the fullest to democratic governance processes. We believe that effective legal frameworks that provide mechanisms for holding transparent, inclusive, and credible elections will prevent political disagreements and popular discontent from degenerating into violence and armed conflict. We commend gender-friendly and pro-youth legislation in several African countries aimed at facilitating the political engagement of women and youth. Number 4, renewing commitment to constitutionalism and democratic progress. As Africa makes 20 years since the founding of the African Union, we support the ratification and implementation of the African Union Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance, and of all relevant legal instruments aimed at strengthening constitutional rule on the continent. We urge former heads of state with a commitment to democratic norms to continue contributing to the strengthening of democracy on the continent through their good offices, in collaboration with civil society, and where needed, serve as mediators, peacemakers, and mentors to the younger generation. Such actions will demonstrate to Africans of all political leanings that there is a rich life of public service after the State House. We encourage the use of this Gaborone Declaration as advocacy to empower citizens to hold their leaders accountable, to fully embrace term limits. It is urgent for all Africans to commit to consolidating democratic progress. We call for the widespread circulation and signing of this Declaration of Principles as a mark of support for constitutionalism, rule of law, and sustainable and stable, secure, and prosperous democratic future on the continent. I thank you.
Thank you.